The first time the Dowager Duchess of Thornwicke laid out her plan to me, she did it over chocolate at 9:30 in the morning, as if she were reading me a weather report. "Edmund," she said, Edmund being my own name, though she used it as one uses the name of a small dog one has trained, "I have decided whom your friend will marry. He does not know. You will not tell him." I set down my cup. The Duke of Thornwicke had been refusing brides for 7 years, and I knew better than to mistake the Dowager's tone for whimsy. "Madam," I said, "he refused the Earl of Reston's daughter last month inside of 3 minutes. She smiled the smile of a woman who had outlived 2 husbands and 3 premierships. "Yes. But he has not yet refused Miss Hannah Lyle because he has not yet noticed her. That, my dear Edmund, is the entire point." I had known Alaric, Duke of Thornwicke, since we were boys at school, where he learned to be feared and I learned to be funny, a useful arrangement for a friendship. By 34 he had become the kind of man whom debutantes' mothers warned their daughters about and then dispatched their daughters toward at the first opportunity. He was tall, dark-browed, given to the silences that other men mistook for judgment, and possessed of an estate the size of a small county. He was also, I had begun to suspect, very tired of being looked at as a fortune with a face attached, tired of being talked at across dinner tables by women instructed to laugh at jokes he had not made. Miss Hannah Lyle, when I first paid her any real attention, was pouring the Dowager's tea. She was perhaps 23, with light brown hair that did not announce itself and gray eyes that, when they met yours, made you suspect she had already understood the joke you were about to make and decided not to embarrass you by laughing too early. Her gown was decent, plain, and had been turned at the cuffs. She was a clergyman's orphaned niece taken in 6 months prior on the recommendation of the Dowager's cousin in Shropshire, and Alaric, when in residence, walked past her in the gallery without seeing her at all. The Dowager began her campaign on a Tuesday. "Alaric," she said at breakfast, "I find I cannot manage the steps to the library this morning. Miss Lyle, would you be so good as to fetch me the Lockhart from the 3rd shelf?" Miss Lyle rose, and Miss Lyle went, and Miss Lyle returned with the correct volume, having walked the length of the dining-room twice. Alaric, who was reading a letter from his steward, did not lift his eyes. The Dowager met mine across the marmalade and lifted, very slightly, one eyebrow. It was, I realized, an admission that move one had failed, and that there were a great many moves remaining. On Wednesday she contrived to seat Miss Lyle at her own elbow at luncheon and to declare, halfway through the soup, that she could not remember the name of the Spanish poet she had loved in her youth. "Lyle, dear, you read the volume to me only last week. What was the wretched man called?" "Garcilaso, ma'am," said Miss Lyle with the smallest possible smile, and he was not wretched, only thwarted. Alaric, who had been carving cold beef with the impatience of a man who would rather be on horseback, paused. He did not look up, but he paused. The Dowager, who had been watching for precisely that pause as a heron watches the water, returned to her soup with the serenity of one whose forecast has just been vindicated. I rode out with him that afternoon because I am the kind of friend a great man uses when he wishes to think aloud without anyone making notes. We pulled up on the ridge above Thornwick Park, the chimneys smoking gently into a sky the color of pewter, and he said without preamble, "Who is the girl?" "Which girl?" I said, because a man is entitled to make his friend work for a thing. "The one your grandmother keeps producing at the table like a conjurer's coin." "Miss Lyle," I said. "Your grandmother's companion, a clergyman's niece. No fortune, no connections, and a memory for Spanish poets." He frowned at the chimneys. "She is being thrust at me. She is doing no such thing. She is fetching books and naming poets. Your grandmother is thrusting her at you, which is a different matter. I will not be managed." "No, of course not," I said pleasantly. "You never have been. It is one of your most consistent illusions." He did not speak to me for the rest of the ride home, which I took as a sign that he had heard me. We came in by the stable yard, and as we crossed the lower hall I heard, from the morning room, the sound of someone playing the pianoforte, not brilliantly, but with the unhurried patience of a person who is playing for one listener and is not afraid of her. Alaric stopped in the corridor. He looked at the morning room door. He did not, in the end, open it. He went up to dress for dinner instead. But he had stopped. and the Dowager, when I encountered her on the landing a quarter of an hour later, looked at me as if she had personally arranged for the music to be in B-flat. By the Friday, she had begun to be brazen. "Alaric," she said at breakfast, "Miss Lyle has not seen the long gallery. It is shameful. You will show it to her after we have eaten, while I rest, and you will tell her about the portraits, because you are the only one of us who can be relied upon to remember which of your great-grandfathers married which heiress." She said this as one issues a dinner invitation that cannot be refused without rudeness. Alaric set down his cup with a precision that in another man would have been a slammed fist. "Grandmother, I am very tired, my dear. You have ridden out with the master of hounds twice this week, and it has wearied me dreadfully," said the Dowager, who was 81 and had the stamina of a small army. "Miss Lyle, finish your tea, child. The Duke will be at your service in a quarter of an hour." I shall confess that I lingered. I had no business in the long gallery, but I have known the Dowager since I was 12, and I knew that what was about to take place was, in her view, the third act of the play, and I was not going to miss it for the world. I followed at a polite distance, half a corridor behind, and so it was that I saw them stop together before the portrait of the third Duke, the one with the sword and the spaniel and the face like a closing door. Alaric had been speaking, briefly and without pleasure, about the Battle of Minden. He had stopped. Miss Lyle was tilting her head a little to the left, the way one does to consider whether a painting has been hung quite straight, and she said, in the perfectly mild voice of one making conversation about the weather, "I had always understood the third Duke to have been at Minden in name only, Your Grace. My uncle, who was something of a scholar of the campaign, used to say that he claimed credit for a charge his cousin actually led. But perhaps he was being unkind." There was a pause of, I should say, 2 seconds. Alaric turned and looked at her. Looked at her, I mean properly, for the first time, and he laughed, not loudly, a single quiet laugh of a kind I had not heard from him in perhaps a year. "Your uncle," he said, "was being accurate. The third Duke was a liar of considerable distinction. May I ask what else your uncle taught you about my ancestors?" "A great deal, Your Grace," she said. "Very little of it would please you. Then you must tell me all of it," he said, "by way of penance for having walked past you in this gallery for 6 months." I withdrew. There are things a friend does not stay to overhear. That night at dinner, he asked her to sit beside him. The Dowager, on his other side, did not look up from her fish. The pace of the thing, after that, the Dowager and I watched with shared, silent astonishment, because we had expected to work harder. It was as if Alaric, having once noticed Miss Lyle, could not understand how he had failed to notice her before, and was now compensating by noticing nothing else. He found her in the morning room and asked her about her uncle. He found her in the garden and asked her what she was reading. He sent the Dowager's chair to the orangery by way of the wrong path, so that Miss Lyle would have to be summoned to find her. And on the long walk back, the two of them, Alaric and Miss Lyle, the Dowager pretending to doze while listening to every word argued very mildly, about whether the Lake Poets had been a force for good or merely for fashion. I rode home each evening, and told my wife that the campaign was being won so thoroughly that the campaigner herself was in danger of being made redundant. My wife, who had liked Miss Lyle from the first, said only "good," and poured me a glass of port. But a great house contains many people, and not all of them wish you well. A regular fixture in the Dowager's drawing-room was Lady Mary's Hever, the daughter of a marquis and a near neighbor, brought up to consider Alaric her natural property in the way one considers a piece of family land. Her father had been refused on her behalf, and she had carried it with a smiling grace anyone who knew her could see was a thin layer over a colder thing. She arrived at Thornwicke on a Sunday in late September with her mother and a small lap dog and a fixed intention. I was there. I saw it. Miss Lyle had been asked, by the Dowager, to read aloud from a book of sermons after tea, on the grounds that the Dowager's eyes were tired. Miss Lyle read very well, clearly, without affectation, with the kind of natural sense that makes a difficult passage feel obvious. Lady Mary's listened with her head a little tilted, as if she were patiently enduring a child's recital. When the reading was done, she said, in the pretty silvery voice she used to do harm, "How perfectly charming, Miss Lyle, was it? You read so nicely. One almost cannot tell that you were brought up to do such things. Did your dear uncle pay for elocution masters, or was it the parish that subscribed? I felt beside me the very smallest stiffening in the dowager. I did not look at Alaric. I did not need to. Miss Lyle laid the book down. She did not flush. She did not stammer. She said in a voice as mild as she had used in the gallery before the third Duke, "My uncle taught me himself, Lady Maries." He was a great believer that a clergyman's house ought to be a place where the language was spoken with care, since so much of what passes for thought in the rest of the world is only badly chosen words. "I am sorry if my reading was not to your standard. I shall ask the Duchess to have it improved." And she picked up the book again and held it in her lap with her hands folded over it, perfectly composed. It was Alaric who spoke. He had risen from his chair. I do not think he had even decided to rise. I think his body had risen ahead of him, the way the body of a man rises when he has been struck. He crossed to where Miss Lyle was sitting, and he stood beside her chair, and he said, not loudly, but with that low absolute clarity that great houses had learned to fall silent for Lady Maries, "Miss Lyle is the guest of my grandmother, and therefore the guest of this house, and therefore of me. You will apologize to her now, or you will leave Thornwicke before nightfall, and you will not return." There was a silence I felt in my back teeth. Lady Maries' mother began to make the sort of noise a woman makes when she is preparing to call something a misunderstanding. Lady Maries looked at Alaric and saw, at last, what the rest of us had spent months seeing. She apologized. It was a poor apology. He accepted it. They were gone by dinner. When the door had closed behind them and the dowager had pronounced, in a tone of mild satisfaction, that she thought she should retire early, Alaric remained standing beside Miss Lyle's chair. He did not move. After a moment he said, without looking at me, "Edmund, leave us, would you?" I left them. I have, I hope, the grace to know when I am no longer required for a scene. I learned what happened next from Miss Lyle herself, years afterward, when she had no reason to embellish and every reason to be honest. He had sat down on the low stool beside her chair, which I am told no Duke of Thornwicke had occupied in 3 generations. He had said, "Miss Lyle, I have been managed by my grandmother since I was 9. She has managed me into riding lessons I did not want, into a university I had no need of, and into the magistracy in spite of my temper. She has managed me this autumn into noticing you, and I am angry with her because I would very much have preferred to notice you on my own." She had said, "Your Grace, I have no part in any management." "I know that," he had said. "If I thought you had, I should not be sitting here. May I ask you a question that I have no right to ask?" "You may ask, Your Grace." "If my grandmother had not arranged that I should walk you to the long gallery, if I had continued, as I had been doing, to pass you in corridors without sight, would you have thought of me at all?" There was, she said, a long pause, and she said, "Your Grace, I have been thinking of you since the 2nd week of my employment, when you stopped on the stairs to lift down a parcel for the housekeeper who could not reach it, and you did it without speaking and walked on without expecting thanks. I have been thinking of you ever since, in a manner I considered shameful, because I am a paid companion in your grandmother's house. I never intended that you should ever know." He had been, she told me, silent for a longer time than she had expected, and then he had said, "Miss Lyle, will you marry me?" Not as a question, as a sentence completed. She had said yes, of course she had said yes. But she had said it on a condition that I in the years since have come to think of as the most characteristic thing about her, and the reason their marriage has been the happiest I have ever observed at close quarters. She had said, "Your Grace, if I marry you, you must promise me that you will never afterwards pretend that you noticed me on your own. Your grandmother arranged this. You and I will love each other, but she did the work. We will both always give her the credit." And he had laughed for the 2nd time that autumn, and the 2nd time I had heard him laugh in a year, and he had said, "Madam, I shall give her the credit on my own monument." The Dowager Duchess was, when we told her in the morning, perfectly composed. She said, "Thank you, my dears. Edmund, ring for fresh chocolate." She did not gloat. She did not crow. She had, I think, allowed herself a great deal of private gloating in advance, the way a careful general lets himself enjoy a victory the night before, so that on the morning of the battle he can be gracious. She did permit herself one remark which I treasure. She said, looking at her grandson over the rim of her cup, "I am pleased, my dear, that you have at last consented to be married. I shall not say I told you so." I shall merely say that I have, in your service, been telling you so for 7 years, and that of all the women I might have selected, Miss Lyle is the one I would have chosen for you in any event. The fact that you have arrived at the same conclusion is, I think, a credit to my patience and to your good sense in that order." They were married very quietly in the Thornwicke chapel 6 weeks later. The dowager wore gray silk and did not, I noticed, dab at her eyes once, which is how I knew she was moved. The Duchess of Thornwicke, for she was the Duchess now, wore a gown of pale ivory that the dowager had commanded from London, and she carried at her wrist on a velvet ribbon a small enameled miniature of an elderly clergyman whom none of us had ever met but whom we all, by then, felt we had known. Alaric, standing at the altar, did not look anywhere but at her face. He had, I believe, given up the pretense that he had ever looked at anything else. The dowager lived another 6 years and saw 2 great-grandchildren born in her own bedroom because she had insisted, and she had a way of insisting that the world found easier to accommodate than resist. She died in early summer holding the new Duchess's hand, and in the very last clear sentence she ever spoke she said, "I told you, Alaric. I have always told you." He bent his head over her hand and wept, my friend, who had not wept before another man since he was 12. The Duchess held the old woman's other hand and said, very softly, the thing she had been saying for years. "We give her the credit, my love. We always give her the credit. I am an old man now, and I have outlived more friends than I care to count. But I will tell you, for nothing, the one thing I know to be true. The great romances of this world are not made by the lovers alone. There is, somewhere in the wings, almost always a person who saw it before either of them did, a grandmother in gray silk, an old governess with a sharp eye, a sister who has watched her brother long enough to know which woman will steady him. We pretend, afterwards, that love was an accident. It is more often the work of a patient hand. And if you are very lucky in this life, you will have a hand like that, working quietly on your behalf, in a morning room at 9:30, with the chocolate going cold beside her and a perfectly serene smile on her face, waiting only for you to notice what she has already arranged.